Welcome to our Cartne video about the Business Side of Music podcast. Our guest is series host, Bob Bender.
Hey, this is Bob Bender. I'm the host and the producer of the Business Side of Music podcast. We've been doing that for about 7 years now. By the time you're watching this, we'll have released our 300th episode. A lot of people ask me, well, how did you get into that position? And honestly, it comes down to about 50 years of me being in the industry. And that sometimes kind of scares me when I realize it's been 5 decades. It's been a lot of different hats. I started out, stage managing and road managing and tour management. Got into concert promotion. I was a promoter representative, produced over 300 concerts and festivals and tours all over the world. Had the opportunity to get into radio and hosted and produced my own radio show for a while out on the West Coast, syndicated radio show. It was jazz because I'm a huge jazz fan. And then I got the very unique opportunity to go to work for a record label. I started out as a radio promotions coordinator, then went on to manager of artist development, which is much like an A&R person, and eventually got into sales. I was director of sales for a couple different record labels and general manager for another label at one point. And, finally, about 7 years ago, got into the podcasting business, wanted to take all of these life experiences that I had learned about and wanted to share that with what we do on the podcast now.
And you're not the original host of the podcast, right?
Yeah, it's actually it was a good friend of yours and mine. Tom Sabella was the creator. He started this in 2009 with Tracy Snow, his co-host, and he did about 100 episodes. His format back then was a little different than mine. Tom had written a book, and so his episodes were based really on kind of different chapters of the books, and they talked about that. Where we have been more guest driven, finding experts in different aspects and different facets of the music business, and that's how we've chartered our show for the last 7 years.
So what would you say is the mission or the purpose of the podcast?
I've always said that the mission of the podcast, the mission statement of the podcast, has always been to entertain, to inform, and to educate. I think if it's not fun, people aren't going to listen to it. At the same time, you want them to learn something. You want them to take something away from it. And and a lot of the guests that we have on the show, they're not necessarily always artists or musicians or singer-songwriters. So, we've had attorneys, entertainment lawyers on the show. We've had artist managers. We've had record producers. And we always want them to share their wisdom and their history and the moments that kind of highlighted them. And I just think that's great information to give to our listeners. I think I would hope that everybody learns something from each episode that they listen to.
Personally, I think it's a powerful podcast for 2 reasons. Number 1, it's the stories behind the music, which are amazing. And then number 2, it's the lessons that people have, the real life experience. Can you name a couple of speakers that you've had and what they've talked about so that people can get an idea?
Sure. One of them that comes to mind right off the bat was Miles Copeland. And Miles was the manager for the Police, and then he went on to manage Sting's career. What was interesting with Miles was his 2 brothers, Ian Copeland, ran a booking agency. So Miles is the manager, Ian's the booking agent for the Police and then Sting. And then Stuart Copeland, the other brother, was the drummer in the band The Police. So it was kind of a family affair. But one of the things I found intriguing with Miles was he did not necessarily come from a musical background. His family, believe it or not, was into military intelligence. His mother worked for the British OSS, and his dad was one of the original members of the Central Intelligence Agency. So it was kind of, an interesting juncture of, his mom and dad are doing this thing that's kind of a super secret spy thing, and he's in the music business. And Miles shared about how he went broke. He went bankrupt in this business and before, he finally pulled himself up by his bootstraps and found success. And I think so many of us have gone through those perils and pitfalls. I think another one that I absolutely loved having on the show was Tony Brown. Tony Brown was originally the piano player for Elvis Presley. And then he went on to produce such great acts as Reba McEntire and the Judds and George Strait, and just on and on and on. And the stories he had to tell, not only about, being with Elvis, but what it was like to be in the studio to work with these different acts and these different artists. And as I said, we've had entertainment lawyers, we've had managers, guys, people like Chuck Thompson, who originally managed the Judds. He's been on the show, and just each of those life journeys that those people carried with them were somewhat similar in many cases, but at the same time, they were all very unique on how they got into the business, how they survived the business, and how they got where they are today. So to me, I just think those are great stories. And then, of course, we do a lot of episodes on entrepreneurs, young people that are getting started in the business. They either have a service to sell or a product that they've created, whether it's an app or a software or it's a website, to help people within the music industry. We're real big on the independent artist, the independent contractor. We will always shoot for the underdog and try to help give them a lift, because it's an extremely tough business. So, every once in a while, we might have an independent artist on the show, or we might have a classic artist on the show. We had Bob Berryhill, who was one of the founders of the Safaris. If you don't know who they are, you've obviously heard of the song Wipeout, which has got one of the greatest, drum solos in it. And, he talks about that life and how they wrote that song in the studio in 15 minutes and how their career went from nothing to, 100 miles an hour overnight, literally. And, I love hearing those stories, and I love sharing those stories with our listeners who are literally all over the world. We're in about 120 countries around the world. And, I think each episode's got to be something that people can listen to and go, wow, that was kind of cool.
So where can they find the podcast?
You can go to, first of all, anywhere where you would listen to podcasts, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, iHeartMedia, any of those, or you can go to www.businesssideofmusic.com. All of our episodes are on there. Over 300 episodes are on there, and it's a great selection and diversity of guests on the show to be able to listen to. So definitely check us out. And you know what? Drop us a line. Let us know if there's something you want to hear.
And lastly, how would somebody who wants to either be a guest or be a sponsor get in touch with you?
You can look at our show notes. Every week in our show notes, we have an email address, which is musicpodcast@mail.com. It's not Gmail, it's mail.com, musicpodcast@mail.com. Or you can email me directly at bob@businesssideofmusic.com and just drop me a line. Let me know if you want to be a guest on the show and what you want to talk about. We have a fantastic studio here in Nashville, where in addition to an audio podcast, we also do a 4-camera video webcast. But we can do things remotely. We've had artists from Belgium and from Germany and all over the world that have been on the show. So yeah, if you think you've got something that might be interesting to our listeners, drop us a line and we'd love to chat.
This concludes our video on the Business Side of Music podcast with our guest, Bob Bender.